So today I want to talk about something that most people are completely missing about this war. Everyone is watching the daily updates. Everyone is tracking the military positions, the political statements, the peace proposals that appear and disappear. Everyone is asking when this war will end. But almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people around the world. What happens if it does not end? What does the world look like? What does your life look like if this war continues not for weeks or months, but for years? And the answer, when you look at it carefully and honestly, is something that governments are not telling their citizens, that mainstream media is barely covering, and that most people are genuinely not prepared for. A prolonged war of this scale does not simply stay in the place where the fighting is happening. It travels. It moves through energy markets and food supply chains, through government budgets and currency values, through the quiet decisions of companies and investors who are already repositioning for a world that looks very different from the one we had just a few years ago. And by the time most ordinary families feel those consequences directly, in their heating bills, their grocery costs, their job security, their savings, the repositioning will already be complete. The people who understood what was coming will already have adjusted. Everyone else will be left trying to catch up. Depending on where you live, depending on how your country and your own financial life are positioned, the continuation of this war will affect you in ways that are very specific, very real, and very avoidable if you understand them early enough. So today I want to walk you through exactly what happens to the global economy, to the major powers, to ordinary families if this war continues, region by region, consequence by consequence. So let us begin. The first thing you need to understand, the foundation of everything I'm going to tell you today, is what historians call the long war trap, and it is one of the most consistently repeated and most consistently underestimated patterns in all of modern history. When a major conflict begins, both sides and the watching world make the same instinctive assumption. This will be resolved in a reasonable amount of time. Military conflicts feel temporary. People assume that the economic pain, the political disruption, the human cost will reach a point where reason prevails and the fighting stops. That assumption has been wrong in almost every major conflict of the past 100 years. World War I was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914. It lasted 4 years and killed 17 million people. The Korean War was supposed to be a brief police action. It lasted 3 years, has never formally ended, and still shapes the security architecture of East Asia today. The conflict in Afghanistan was supposed to be a swift operation. It lasted 20 years. The Iraq War, declared over in 2003 with a banner that read "Mission Accomplished," continued in various forms for nearly 2 decades. The long war trap is not about military failure or diplomatic incompetence, though both play a role. It is about the gap between how wars feel at the beginning and what they become once the economic, political, and social systems around them begin to adapt to the war's continuation. Once supply chains restructure around a conflict, once governments lock in spending commitments, once populations adjust their expectations, the war acquires a momentum of its own that is far harder to stop than it was to start. The question is no longer whether this war could become a long war. The economic indicators, the political commitments, and the strategic calculations of every major actor involved suggest that it already is one. The question is, what does a world that has adapted to the continuation of this conflict actually look like? And which nations, which economies, and which ordinary families will be most damaged by that adaptation? The answer depends on one framework. Which countries are structurally exposed to the specific consequences that prolonged conflict produces? Rising energy costs, disrupted food supply, expanding debt, and the gradual erosion of the international norms that keep global trade functioning. Let me walk you through each major region with that framework in mind. On the surface, Europe looks like it has already absorbed the worst of the economic shock from this conflict. Energy prices spiked and then moderated. Governments introduced support packages to help households with rising bills. The recession that many economists predicted has not materialized with the severity that was feared. Europe looks like it is managing, But underneath that surface, Europe is experiencing something that is far more dangerous than a sharp crisis: a slow bleed. The kind of economic damage that does not make the front page because it happens gradually, quarter by quarter, year by year, until one day the accumulated weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. European industrial energy costs, the price that manufacturers pay to power their factories, are now running at approximately 2 to 3 times the level of American industrial energy costs. That gap is not temporary, it is structural, and it is producing a very simple, very rational business decision across European manufacturing. It is cheaper to produce in America, in Asia, or in the Middle East than it is to produce in Europe. So companies are leaving, quietly, without dramatic announcements, but steadily and in growing numbers. Germany has lost over 60,000 manufacturing jobs in the past 2 years as industrial companies have relocated or scaled back operations. For a country whose entire economic identity, whose trade surplus, whose government revenues, whose middle-class prosperity is built on industrial manufacturing, that is not a statistic. That is the beginning of a structural transformation that will reshape European society for a generation. For ordinary European families, the continuation of this war means something very specific: the erosion of the economic model that funded the healthcare systems, the pension systems, and the social safety nets that Europeans have come to regard as permanent features of their lives. Those systems were built on the productivity of an industrial economy that is now under fundamental pressure. The longer this war continues, the deeper that pressure becomes. Now let us turn to the economy that faces the most acute version of this same challenge. On the surface, China looks like a country that has positioned itself well for a prolonged conflict. It maintains relationships with Russia, with Iran, and with Western nations simultaneously. Its economy, while slowing, is still one of the largest on Earth. Its military is growing, its diplomatic influence is expanding. China does not appear to be an immediate victim of this war's continuation. But underneath that surface, China is facing a convergence of pressures that a prolonged conflict makes significantly worse, and that Beijing's own internal data is increasingly unable to conceal. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy needs from the Gulf region. Every month that this conflict continues, every month that Gulf supply chains remain under pressure, every month that the Strait of Hormuz carries the risk of disruption, China's energy vulnerability deepens, and China's economic model, which remains fundamentally dependent on importing cheap energy and converting it into manufactured exports, becomes harder to sustain. The numbers that tell the real story are in Chinese consumer behavior. Chinese household savings rates have risen to approximately 40%, meaning ordinary Chinese families are saving nearly half of what they earn, rather than spending it. That is not a sign of prosperity. That is a sign of fear. Chinese people are looking at the economic uncertainty around them, at the slowing growth, at the property market that has lost trillions of dollars in value, and they are protecting themselves the only way they know how, by holding on to their money. A country where consumers will not spend cannot transition to a consumer-driven economy. And a country that cannot transition to a consumer-driven economy remains dependent on an export model that is itself being challenged by Western efforts to reduce supply chain dependence on China. If this war continues for another 2 or 3 years, China will not have collapsed, but it will have lost a window of opportunity for economic adaptation that may not open again for a very long time. For ordinary Chinese families, the continuation of this war means more economic pressure, more uncertainty, and a government that is being forced to make increasingly difficult choices between its military ambitions and the economic conditions its citizens need to believe the future is worth investing in. Now let us look at the region where the consequences of continuation are already the most visible. On the surface, parts of the Middle East look like they have been at the center of conflict for so long that continued war is simply the normal condition. The region has endured decades of instability. Its people are resilient. Its governments have adapted to operating in difficult circumstances. The war's continuation might seem, from the outside, like more of what the region has always managed to survive. But underneath that surface, the continuation of this war at its current scale is pushing several Middle Eastern countries toward a breaking point that is categorically different from the instability of previous decades. This is not about political turbulence or even military destruction, as devastating as both of those are. This is about the fundamental physical capacity of some countries to sustain their populations. Lebanon's economy has already contracted by more than 40% since 2019, one of the worst economic collapses of any country not formally at war in modern history. Jordan is absorbing refugee populations that now represent more than 20% of its total population, placing enormous strain on water supplies, food systems, and government services that were already stretched to their limits. Egypt, with a population of over 110 million people, is facing food import costs that its government budget cannot sustainably absorb at current global commodity prices. The bombs fall in specific places, but hunger, water scarcity, and economic collapse do not respect the same boundaries that military conflict does. They spread outward. They move through the region's interconnected supply chains, migration patterns, and financial systems. A continuation of this war does not keep the consequences contained. It multiplies them and pushes them further. For ordinary families across the Middle East, people who are not parties to the conflict and never chose to be near it, the continuation of this war means the slow disappearance of the economic conditions that make ordinary life possible. That is the dimension of this conflict that the daily military updates almost never capture. Now let us turn to the two countries whose response to continuation will shape the outcome more than any other. On the surface, America looks like the actor best positioned to sustain a prolonged conflict. It has the world's largest economy, it has the world's most powerful military, its energy sector is largely self-sufficient, and unlike every other major power in this conflict, America can project military force globally without putting its own territory at direct risk. But underneath that surface, America is accumulating costs from the continuation of this war that are not showing up in the places most people look, but that are quietly reshaping its long-term financial position in ways that matter enormously. America is currently carrying $34 trillion in national debt. Every year that this conflict continues, that number grows, through military support commitments, through the economic support packages that allies require to maintain their participation, and through the broader inflationary pressure that prolonged conflict creates in global commodity markets. Interest payments on that debt now exceed $1 trillion annually, making debt servicing the single largest line item in the federal budget, larger than defense spending, larger than Medicare. The petrodollar system, the mechanism by which Gulf oil sales are conducted in U.S. dollars, creating permanent global demand for American currency, and allowing America to borrow at costs no other country could sustain, is under quiet but serious pressure. Saudi Arabia has already conducted some oil sales in Chinese yuan. The Gulf states are diversifying their reserve holdings. If that process accelerates under the pressure of a prolonged conflict, America loses the financial foundation that makes its debt level manageable. For ordinary American families, the continuation of this war means something very tangible. Persistent inflation that erodes the purchasing power of wages and savings, interest rates that remain higher than they would otherwise be, and a gradual tightening of the government's fiscal room to fund the domestic programs that millions of Americans depend on. The war is not destroying America, but it is costing America in ways that most Americans are not being asked to fully reckon with. Now let us look at the actor whose long-term trajectory this conflict is affecting most profoundly. On the surface, Africa appears geographically distant from the front lines of this conflict. Its governments are not sending troops. Its armies are not involved. Most African nations have officially maintained positions of neutrality, calling for peace while avoiding alignment with either side. But underneath that surface, the continuation of this war is producing consequences in Africa that are among the most severe of any region on Earth, precisely because Africa's economies have the least capacity to absorb external shocks. Africa imports approximately 85% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine combined. Global fertilizer prices, directly tied to natural gas costs that this conflict is keeping elevated, have risen by over 200% from their pre-conflict baseline in the most affected markets. And the transport and logistics costs that connect African markets to global food supply chains have increased substantially as shipping routes are disrupted and insurance costs for vessels operating in conflict-adjacent waters rise. The consequence chain is not complicated, but it is devastating. Higher fertilizer costs mean lower agricultural yields from African farmers who cannot afford the inputs. Lower yields mean less domestic food production. Less domestic production combined with more expensive imports means food prices that a significant portion of the African population simply cannot afford. The UN's World Food Program has already identified over 20 African countries where food security is approaching crisis levels directly linked to the economic consequences of this conflict. This is where the human reality of a prolonged war becomes most stark. The bombs do not fall on African soil. The missiles do not target African cities. But the hunger that follows a disrupted global food system does not ask where the fighting is happening before it decides where to arrive. For ordinary African families, the continuation of this war is not an abstraction. It is showing up in the price of bread, the availability of cooking oil, and the weight of children who are not eating enough. So now let us zoom out and look at the biggest picture of all. Because when you look at every region we have just covered, Europe's industrial erosion, China's narrowing window, the Middle East's accumulating breaking points, America's quiet financial costs, Africa's food crisis, a single pattern becomes visible that is more important than any individual country's story. A prolonged war does not simply damage the countries and regions most directly involved. It restructures the global order. It accelerates the trends that were already developing and makes them irreversible before the world has had time to prepare for them. The trend toward deglobalization, the process by which countries are reducing their dependence on faraway supply chains and trying to produce more of what they need closer to home, was already underway before this conflict. But a prolonged war has compressed what might have been a 20-year gradual transition into a 10-year forced restructuring. Companies are moving factories. Governments are subsidizing domestic energy production. Trade relationships that took decades to build are being replaced by new ones that reflect security concerns rather than pure economic efficiency. The trend toward currency multipolarity, the slow erosion of the US dollar's position as the world's only reserve currency, was already visible in China's yuan internationalization efforts, in the BRICS nations' discussions of alternative payment systems, and in the Gulf states' willingness to experiment with non-dollar oil pricing. A prolonged war accelerates every one of those experiments, because every year of conflict gives the nations involved more reason to reduce their exposure to the dollar-based financial system that America's adversaries see as a weapon. And here is the crucial insight that most people are completely missing. The world that emerges from a prolonged war will not look like the world that existed before it with some damage repaired. It will be a structurally different world, different supply chains, different alliances, different financial architecture, different assumptions about who protects whom and on what terms. The countries and companies that understand this are already positioning for that different world. The countries and companies that are waiting for a return to normal are positioning for a world that will not come back. The single most important question in global economics and geopolitics right now is not who wins this war on the battlefield. It is who is building the institutions, the supply chains, and the alliances that will define the post-war order, and whether they will be ready before the transition becomes irreversible. I want to end with the most uncomfortable and most surprising conclusion in this entire analysis. Because when you look honestly at the incentive structures around this conflict, when you ask not who says they want this war to end, but who actually benefits from its continuation, the answer is deeply unsettling. You might expect me to name a specific country, Russia perhaps, which benefits from a West divided and distracted, or Iran, whose regional influence expands in the chaos. Those analyses have merit, but they are not the most important answer. The group that most structurally benefits from the continuation of this war is the global defense industry. And I want to be precise about what that means because this is not a conspiracy theory. It is a straightforward matter of economics. Global defense spending has increased by over $800 billion annually since this conflict began. Companies that produce missiles, artillery shells, armored vehicles, drones, and the electronic systems that modern warfare depends on are operating at or beyond full capacity. Their order books are full for years ahead. Their profit margins are at historic highs. Their share prices have significantly outperformed the broader market. The continuation of this war is not a tragedy for these companies. It is their most profitable business environment in a generation. This matters not because defense companies are uniquely malicious. They are responding rationally to the economic incentives in front of them, as any business does. It matters because defense companies employ millions of people in politically important constituencies. They fund research institutions, think tanks, and policy organizations. They have lobbyists in every major capital in the world. And the interests of those companies, interests that are genuinely served by the continuation of this conflict, are deeply embedded in the political systems that are supposed to be working toward its resolution. This is not weakness in the system. This is the system working exactly as it was built to work, for the interests that are most organized, most funded, and most politically connected. The ordinary families paying the costs of this prolonged war in their energy bills, their food prices, and their children's futures are not equally organized. That asymmetry is the most important and the most overlooked fact about what happens if this war continues. That is not cynicism. That is simply what the evidence shows. So let us just recap what we covered today. Europe is experiencing a slow industrial bleed, not a dramatic collapse, but a steady loss of manufacturing capacity driven by energy costs that are 2 to 3 times higher than its main competitors. Germany alone has lost over 60,000 manufacturing jobs in 2 years. The longer this war continues, the deeper that structural damage becomes. China is running out of the time it needs to transition away from its energy-dependent export model. Its consumers are saving rather than spending, its property market has lost trillions in value, and its window for economic adaptation is narrowing with every year this conflict extends. The Middle East, beyond the immediate front lines, is approaching a breaking point in several countries, driven not by military damage, but by the cascading economic consequences of prolonged conflict on food, water, and government finances. America is accumulating financial costs, in debt, in inflation, and in the quiet erosion of the petrodollar system, that are not visible in daily headlines but are real and compounding. Its $34 trillion debt is being serviced at rates that leave less room for everything else each year. Africa is absorbing the most severe humanitarian consequences of any region, with 85% of its wheat supply coming from conflict-affected sources and fertilizer costs that are putting domestic food production out of reach for millions of farmers. And the group whose interests are most structurally served by the war's continuation, the global defense industry, is embedded deeply enough in the political systems of every major power that its influence on the pace of resolution deserves far more public attention than it receives.